Judica County. My name is Josh Whitaker. I'm your host. Today, we're going to talk to you a little bit about search and seizure in North Carolina, what you can and can't be searched for in different situations. Again, today will be just a general overview, just an introduction to the topic. We've got a panel today. With me, to my right, is Mr. Damian McCullers, a partner with the law firm of McCullers, Whitaker & Hamer.
Hi there.
And to his right, Mr. Joe Hamer, also a partner with the law firm of McCullers, Whitaker & Hamer.
Hello.
Well, Damian, what are we going to start out with today?
I think we're just going to kind of do a broad overview about, kind of what to do if you've been pulled over, officers asking you questions, just what you can say, what you can't say, what you can refuse, can't refuse, that type of thing. We get questions about this a lot, just kind of in general, just people wanting to know, hey, what are my rights as it relates to this? So we thought it'd be a good topic to kind of touch on.
So you do have constitutional rights on what any government body, government entity, law enforcement officer can ask you for, how you can be treated. And so we're going to be talking about, what an officer can and can't get from you and kind of some situations that go along with that. I think we'll preface this with, there's never a reason for you not to be, that should always be polite and cooperative with law enforcement to the extent that you're legally obligated
Absolutely.
to be. And of course, if the law enforcement officer is not returning the favor. In my experience, I'm not a criminal attorney, but law enforcement, they have a tough job to do. And for the most part, they try to do it the best they can. That's not always how things end up. We're certainly not perfect attorneys.
Absolutely.
So we don't want this to be overcritical of law enforcement officers. That's not why we're presenting this information today. But I think everybody should be aware of their. I think some people think they have constitutional rights that they don't have.
Absolutely.
Sure. So this, I think this kind of can cut both ways. You'll know what you can and can't do, and I think that could even be helpful to law enforcement. So definitely don't want to be anti-law enforcement, but again, you want to be prepared. It's always a nerve-wracking encounter. When what I would call us.
I call it the gulp moment when you see the lights and you're like, crap.
Yeah,
and from that point forward, it's just, it can be nerve-wracking for some folks. So
we'll talk. You've been pulled over, and we've covered some of this in different podcasts. We never just kind of focused on this. So we'll set the scene. But basically, you're driving, day or night, lights come on behind you. You know you're being pulled over. So what should we do from there?
Well, first thing you want to do is you want to pull over into a safe area, preferably well lit, if at all possible. I will tell folks, if this is a nighttime scenario and you're just kind of, whatever, back roads, and you just completely don't feel comfortable, I would suggest, one, reduce your rate of speed, turn on your flashers. That is acknowledging, one, that you see the officer, that, you're acknowledging, hey, I see that you're attempting to pull me over. I am not running. I am not attempting to elude you, which would be the charge if they felt like you were trying to get away from them. Once you do that, as soon as you can, get to a place where you can stop, where you feel comfortable. I would also tell people, just in that particular situation, and again, this is just for an extreme situation where you're just kind of maybe in the middle of nowhere, and just can't get somewhere immediately. But my first rule to you is, if you can, pull over immediately. If you can't, then again, turn on the flashers, decrease your speed. If you have the opportunity, you may even want to call an emergency number and just say, hey, my name is Damian McCullers. I'm on whatever, Route 210 in whatever county. There is an officer behind me. I just want to make sure that I acknowledge I see him. I am pulling over to a safe location. And let that be that. Once you've done that, generally the conversation is, officer comes to your car, asks you for license or registration. Obviously, you want to produce that. If you are driving on the street or highway in North Carolina, I would tell you that you have the obligation, if asked, to produce a license and registration to the law enforcement officer.
So you've been pulled over, you pulled over safely, officer has asked you for some identification, and he can do that.
Absolutely.
Right, and you need to provide that.
You should, yes.
Right. License, registration.
So at that point, and I guess different agencies do different things different ways. Some officers may come back, they may go to their vehicle and say, hey, Mr. McCullers, sit tight. I'm gonna go run your license, registration, make sure everything's good, and come back to the vehicle, and then have whatever conversation that they're going to have with you. Most of the time, it's at that point that whatever questioning may take place is going to start to happen. So that may be where you get the, have you had anything to drink tonight? Where are you going? Do you have any illegal weapons or drugs in the car? I mean, it can go several different ways depending on what the officer is investigating.
That's right, because at this point, we don't really know. He may have pulled you over for speeding, tail light, registration.
Absolutely. Registration, anything.
And the officer doesn't really have to tell you.
No, so the officer does not have to tell you what they pulled you over for at that particular moment. I think at that point, if they're in an investigation at that point. Now, whether they go back to the vehicle and print a ticket out and then come back and say, hey, Mr. McCullers, you know, I stopped you for speeding. I also noticed that your registration was out of date. Here's your ticket for speeding, whatever, 40 and a 35, and here's your ticket for your expired registration. But you are not in a position to demand to know why you were stopped at that very moment when you are stopped. And at least I would say up until a point that the investigation is concluded.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, at least my understanding, and again, I may be wrong. I'm an attorney, not a criminal attorney, as I've already probably said 3 or 4 times now. But we don't really, if the officer is asking us questions to further his investigation, we're under no legal obligation to answer.
You are under no obligation to answer those questions at that point. You certainly, and I always advise, you be cordial. You know, you don't have to be belligerent, but you have the absolute right to say, I respectfully decline to answer those questions. And it can be the most simple of questions. It doesn't have to be big, huge criminal investigation questions. It can be where you're coming from. You know, you're just not obligated to answer those questions. And some officers will absolutely respect that right. Some officers may not necessarily like it, but say, all right. So that's just kind of how that works. But as far as you and your constitutional right, you are not under any obligation to answer that specific question.
There's no legal penalty.
There's no legal penalty for you. Actually, you have a right to remain silent.
But practically speaking, we still want to be cordial and polite. Just because these are human beings we're dealing with. And if you get combative, it's not going to benefit.
Well.
It's just not going to benefit you.
So in a prior podcast, we've made a distinction against questions that you don't have to answer, that you don't have to respond to, and commands that you do need to you know. So you don't have to answer any questions that may incriminate you. You certainly have a constitutional right not to incriminate yourself. But if an officer gives you a legally justifiable command, and let's talk a little bit about what a command would be.
Absolutely, and you're right. We've talked about this before, but it's always good to just talk about it again. And I always attempt in dealing with clients to let them know if an officer is asking you a question, then that's probably a situation where you have a right to either comply or refuse. But if he's giving you a command, you need to comply. So the difference would be, you know, do you mind telling me where you're coming from tonight? That's a question. Ma'am, please exit the vehicle is a command. He's giving you an affirmative action to take, meaning that being getting out of the vehicle. And at that point, you need to exit the vehicle. And it's just that simple.
So let's take this to the next step. So let's say you've declined to answer any of the officer's questions legally. You've done it politely, and we'll go ahead and say the officer, you've got an officer who respects that, and he's not trying to ask you any more questions. One of the questions they may ask is, you mind if I search your vehicle? You mind if I take a look around?
Right.
And so this is where we talk about searches, illegal searches, what an officer can and can't search. And so the answer to that question, I presume, is you could say no.
You have a right to say no. I am not giving you permission to search my vehicle. Now, there are caveats to this, and just because you say no is not the end-all, be-all. At that point, the same way you have certain things that you can do, and you can say, no, I don't want you to search my vehicle. If there are certain things present, the officer can indeed search the vehicle regardless. If he is under the impression that there are fruits of a crime there, he can search the vehicle. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, what I see that comes out of this is if there's an odor of marijuana about the car, that's enough for that officer to get into that vehicle. You know, and I've heard people say, well, it was just a roach. Well, just a roach is illegal, and that gets that officer into that vehicle. So, yes, you have the right again, to say, no, I decline, and I'm not going to allow you to search my vehicle. But there are, again, kind of caveats and exceptions to your being able to assert that right.
Well, and then this is what this is going to do. The officer is going to have to make a decision. If he thinks he has authority to search your vehicle, then he's going to do it, and you need to obey those commands. And your attorney can worry about later whether that's a legal or an illegal search. But once an officer's made up his mind, compliance, I would think, is really the best thing you can advise.
Absolutely. And one other thing with that is, you can say, I am not giving you permission to search my vehicle. And at that point, the officer is going to make a decision about whether to further the investigation or to end it. If the officer chooses to further the investigation, that does not mean that just because you asserted that right, that it's over. That officer may choose to call for a K-9 unit. Mm-hmm. That K-9 unit may be able to walk around the vehicle because, again, that's not necessarily a search of your vehicle. It's the exterior of your vehicle, so you don't have an expectation of privacy in the exterior of your vehicle. Now, if the dog alerts on your vehicle, then that gets that officer to a point where he has probable cause to search. So, again, asserting your right is good and well, but there are also caveats and exceptions to you asserting that right.
Anything else that we should talk about in relation to being stopped and what you can and can't do during a stop?
Beyond that, I mean, you have the right always to remain silent. You do not have to say anything about anything. I would also tell you that, and some of this stuff is just common sense stuff, but, if you have, and this goes back to one of our podcasts that we've done before, but if you have a firearm in the vehicle, and it's your legally owned and possessed firearm, I always tell clients, if you know your firearm is in the vehicle, even if you have a concealed permit, once you know and those lights come on, hands at 10 and 2, don't move, don't say anything until that officer gets to that window, and you need to say, sir or ma'am, I have my legally owned firearm in the vehicle, I have my concealed permit, and let them direct you at what to do from that point.
If you have your concealed permit, you're supposed to.
Right. I mean, you're obligated to do so, but, again, people get nervous, they see the lights, and they forget. So, if you're in that situation, and the officer will, I've had that situation happen where I'm having that conversation, and a lot of times the officer will thank you and say, listen, I really appreciate you telling me that, and it makes everything that much better because, you're not moving, you're not making any sudden movements, you're telling them that your weapon is in the car. And a lot of times with that, they may ask you to exit the vehicle so they can clear the scene. Obviously, that's for their safety, and that's perfectly reasonable. But just having done that and extending that courtesy to them goes a long way.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I got pulled over one time speeding in my truck, and I was in a hurry. And so I saw the officer, and he wasn't getting out of the car real quick. So I unbuckled my seatbelt. I started getting my registration and my license together because I wanted to be ready. He didn't like that. That can make a law enforcement officer very nervous. I like the 10 and 2 till they get there and they make their request from you because that's a tough job.
And if you think of it from their perspective, so they're behind you, and you're pulled over, they have no idea what you're doing. You could be reaching for a firearm that's in your glove compartment and waiting for the officer to get there. So it just kind of, the optics of it are bad. So a good rule of thumb is, which I tell my clients all the time, as soon as you pull your car over, hands 10 and 2, and you wait for the officer to get there. That way you're not making any sudden movements. They can see exactly what you're doing, and you're telling them what you're doing. So it doesn't look like you're trying to hide anything or that you're, moving something around. One other thing, and again, it's a common sense thing, but people just get nervous sometimes when they get pulled over. Put your car in park. You pull over and you got your foot on the brake and you're just sitting there. And you really don't think about it because you're nervous. Yeah. And you could have done absolutely nothing wrong, but you're just nervous. And you have your foot on the brake, and then all of a sudden the officer starts talking to you, and you start rolling away. So, it's little things like that. Put your car in park, hands 10 and 2. I promise you it'll go a long way with the officer.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll plan on sitting down sometime in the future and talking about search and seizure and your home. We won't tackle that today. We'll leave it at your vehicle in a stop kind of situation.
Sure.
But again, hopefully that's been a helpful overview, and if we can do anything for you, we're all with the law firm of McCullers, Whitaker & Hamer, again in North Carolina. 919-772-7000 is our number. Otherwise, thanks.
Stay safe.